You are on your knees in that cold hallway at 2 a.m., your joints throbbing as your fingers brush against something frozen in plastic, hidden beneath the Brazilian cherry floorboards. This heavy weight in your chest hasn't let up for weeks, a growing rot that has been clawing at your bones since the day you buried your son. You've tried to pray it away, worked until your hands bled, and trusted those who claim to love you. But that sharp pain in your gut isn't a sign of collapse. It's a messenger revealing the truth about a house built on lies. In the next few minutes, you will finally understand what is really happening. My name is Arthur Miller. At 64, I'm a retired master carpenter who spent 40 years building luxury estates I could never dream of owning. My hands are mapped with scars from chisels and saws, a permanent record of a life spent measuring twice and cutting once. But no tool could fix the hole left when my wife Martha died 4 years ago. I still carry her vintage tape measure in my pocket, the metal cold against my hip, reminding me of the scent of her lavender soap and the way she'd polish the silver locket containing our son David's first baby tooth. I thought I'd already survived my greatest collapse when I buried her. My routine is a fortress of habit. I'm awake by 5, staring at David's graduation photo through the steam of black coffee. I have my daughter Claire, a nurse who lives 2 states away, and Sarah, David's fragile widow whom I've tried to protect. Before we continue this journey into the rot behind the walls, I want to thank you for being here. I'm sharing this from my workshop in Ohio. Where are you watching from? Comment your city below. Also, while this story is inspired by real family betrayals, names and specific details have been dramatized to protect the innocent. I spent days fixing squeaky hinges, never realizing the real structural failure was hidden much deeper. I was clearing out David's cramped garage on Tuesday morning, November 4th, when I found a crumpled yellow receipt wedged behind a rusted workbench. It was from Midwest Hardwood Supply, dated just 3 weeks before his sudden passing. My heart skipped as I read the line item: 16 cartons of premium Brazilian cherry floorboards, totaling $3,400, paid in full with cash. My hands turned cold, the paper fluttering against my calloused palms. Just 2 days before that date, David had sat at my kitchen table, weeping because he supposedly couldn't afford his $40 heart medication. I tried to tell myself it was just a side job, but the structural lies were already starting to groan. Then I saw the canvas tool bag in the corner, the one David claimed he'd pawned to cover his electric bill. I unzipped it, expecting empty space, but found his grandfather's vintage Starrett chisels, polished and sharp enough to shave with. They hadn't been hawked. They'd been used recently, the fine sawdust of cherry wood still clinging to the steel. A heavy, nameless suspicion began to coil in my gut like a snake. If David had the money for luxury lumber and never sold his tools, why was he playing the part of a starving man to his own father? I stared at those shimmering blades, wondering if the son I buried was the same man I thought I knew. I didn't say a word to Sarah when she came home that night, her eyes red from what I now realized was practiced grief. I sat in my darkened kitchen, the $2 million hidden back under those Brazilian cherry boards, but the weight of it was pressing against my chest like a lead slab. On Wednesday, November 5th, I started a log in a small pocket notebook Martha gave me years ago. I watched from my porch as Sarah left at 10:15 a.m., supposedly for a grief counseling session. Instead, I saw her drive the opposite way, toward the industrial district where David used to work at Vance Construction. Wood doesn't lie, and neither do tire tracks in gravel. I spent the afternoon hunched over the kitchen table, spreading out the official debt notices Mark Vance had sent me. My carpenter's eyes noticed something that a banker might have missed. The ink on the signatures for the $80,000 promissory notes looked suspiciously fresh, not like documents signed over 2 years as they claimed. I took out my magnifying glass and compared the M in David's supposed signature to his old high school diploma. The slant was off by precisely 5 degrees, a mechanical imitation rather than a fluid stroke. Someone had sat in a quiet room and manufactured a tragedy, piece by jagged piece, just to drain my life savings into their own pockets. At 6:45 p.m. on Thursday, I found a crumpled envelope in the recycling bin that Sarah must have missed. It was a bank statement from an offshore entity called Lakeside Holdings, addressed to her maiden name. There was a deposit of $12,000 made on October 14th, the very day we held David's wake. My hands shook as I realized I had handed her my last $80,000 in a cashier's check while she was already sitting on a secret fortune. The betrayal felt like a splinter driven deep under my fingernail, a constant, throbbing reminder that the woman I was trying to protect was actually the one holding the knife. She was celebrating while I was mourning. I knew I couldn't handle this structural rot alone, so I called Jim Halloway, a retired detective who spent 30 years smelling lies before they're even spoken. We met at the Rusty Anchor Diner at 7 a.m. on Friday morning. Jim has a face like a topographic map and eyes that don't miss a single twitch of a lip. I handed him the ledger I'd retrieved from the floorboard cache along with the forged debt papers. He didn't say much at first, just sipped his black coffee and traced the serial numbers on one of the $100 bills I'd brought as proof. "Artie," he said quietly, "this isn't just a family squabble. You've stumbled into a professional-grade execution." Jim pulled a specialized UV light from his pocket and swept it over the signatures on the debt documents Mark Vance provided. Under the violet glow, the truth bled out. The paper used for the 2021 notices had watermarks from a 2023 manufacturing batch. It was a physical impossibility, a chronological lie that proved every cent I had forgiven was based on a ghost debt. Mark and Sarah hadn't just waited for David to die. They had been building a financial cage around him for months. The $80,000 I gave them wasn't for arrears. It was a bonus for their successful deception, paid for with 40 years of my hard sweat and labor. As Jim dug deeper into the digital copies of the ledger I'd photographed, he found the second layer of the rot. Sarah hadn't just been receiving offshore deposits. She was on the Vance construction payroll as a consultant under a shell company. Every month for the last year, while David was supposedly losing money to gambling, Sarah was pocketing $5,000 performance bonuses. The narrative they sold me, that David was a loser who gambled away our future, was a carefully scripted play designed to keep me from asking questions. They made me ashamed of my own son to ensure I wouldn't look too closely at the woman sleeping in his bed every night. I felt a cold rage replacing sorrow. We were sitting in Jim's garage at 2:15 p.m. when he noticed a black SUV idling at the end of his driveway. It was the same vehicle I'd seen parked 2 blocks away from David's house earlier that morning. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't just about money anymore. They were tracking my movements, sensing that the dumb old carpenter was finally measuring the dimensions of their lie. If they knew I had the ledger, my life wasn't worth the paper it was written on. Jim handed me a small, concealed GPS tracker and told me to keep my phone on at all times for safety. When I returned to my apartment at 5:30 p.m., a man with a jagged scar across his chin was leaning against my doorframe. He called himself Snake and claimed he was there to collect on a secondary interest David owed. It was a blatant intimidation tactic, a performance meant to keep me in a state of fear so I'd stay submissive. He leaned in close, smelling of cheap menthol and stale beer, and whispered that it would be a shame if the widow had an accident because of David's old mistakes. I looked him right in the eye, my carpenter's grip tightening on my keys, realizing Sarah was using her own victim status as a weapon. I retreated inside and locked the deadbolt, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small slip of paper Jim had found tucked into the back of the ledger. It was a handwritten note from David, dated the night of his death, mentioning a final meeting at 11 p.m. at the warehouse. But the police report said he died in his sleep at 10 p.m. The timeline was shattered. Before we dive into the dangerous truth of what really happened that night, I have to ask you something. If you were Arthur, Would you have forgiven that $80,000 debt without seeing proof? Type yes or no below. Jim called me at 2 a.m. on Saturday, his voice a low growl of pure adrenaline. He had spent the last 6 hours cross-referencing the LLCs from the Lakeside Holdings statement with public city records. It wasn't just Mark Vance and Sarah. 3 members of the local zoning board and an official at the county auditor's office were silent partners in these shell companies. This wasn't a small-time construction fraud. It was a systematic siphoning of the $30 million municipal redevelopment fund. My son hadn't just stolen from a boss. He had disrupted a criminal syndicate that owned half the city. The rot wasn't just in David's floorboards. It was the foundation of our entire town. We met at the workshop at dawn, the air smelling of cedar and cold iron. Jim spread out the printouts, circling a recurring transaction of $400,000 marked as miscellaneous equipment. I pulled one of the vacuum-sealed bricks from my hidden safe and checked the serial numbers against the digital scan Jim provided. They matched perfectly. This $2 million was the slush fund for the redevelopment project, and David had somehow intercepted the physical delivery. He wasn't a gambler losing his shirt. He was a thief who stole from thieves, hoping to use the cash as leverage to buy our safety from the very people he worked for. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of retroactive guilt that nearly doubled me over. I remembered the last Sunday in October, when David came over with deep circles under his eyes and asked to borrow my old truck for a long haul. I told him no, lecturing him about responsibility and how he needed to stop running from his problems. I didn't know he was trying to move this dangerous weight out of his house. My tough love had pinned him in a corner with nowhere to hide. I gripped Martha's tape measure so hard the metal edges bit into my palm. A silent apology to a son who was braver than I ever gave him credit for. At 11:30 a.m., Sarah arrived at my apartment unannounced, her face a mask of fragile concern that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. She brought a container of beef stew, but she spent the entire visit glancing toward my locked workshop door. She mentioned that some bad men had been asking about David's old tools and wondered if I had moved anything from the garage for safekeeping. Every word was a probe, a surgical attempt to see if I had discovered the hidden compartment. I realized then that she didn't just want the money. She needed to know if David had left a trail that led directly back to her and Mark Vance. After she left, I returned to David's house with Jim to perform a more invasive structural sweep. We weren't just looking for cash anymore. We were looking for the why. Under the third joist of the Brazilian cherry section, I felt a small, recessed latch. I slid it back, revealing a velvet-lined cavity. Inside wasn't more money, but a small brown glass vial labeled Digitalis with a prescription date of October 12th. 3 days before David's heart stopped. The name on the label wasn't Sarah's, but her sick mother, a woman Jim had already confirmed passed away in a nursing home 3 years ago. The murder weapon was hidden right in the vault. The risk shifted from financial to fatal when I walked to my truck at 4 p.m. All 4 tires had been slashed with professional precision, and a single Brazilian cherry wood shaving was tucked under my windshield wiper. It was a message from Mark Vance. They knew I was looking at the floorboards. My hand shook as I realized they weren't waiting for me to find the money anymore. They were preparing to clear the structural defect that was me. I wasn't just a grieving father. I was the last loose thread in a $30 million tapestry of blood and greed. The hunter had officially become the prey in his own quiet neighborhood. Jim took me to a safe house, but the fear followed us like a shadow. He revealed that Sarah wasn't just Mark's mistress. She had been his primary informant inside the construction firm for years. She was the one who flagged David's honesty as a threat to their operation. They hadn't just killed him for the money. They killed him because he was going to the FBI. The $80,000 Sarah begged from me wasn't for bills. It was a sick game they played, a way to humiliate David's memory while I funded their escape. Every cent I gave her was used to pay the very men who likely held David down. I spent the night staring at the vial of digitalis, the amber glass reflecting the flickering light of a cheap motel lamp. I realized David must have known he was being poisoned. He wasn't just hiding money. He was hiding the evidence of his own execution, trusting that my carpenter's eye would eventually find the leak in the floor. The blind dovetail wasn't a boast. It was a signal. He knew I'd be the only one to recognize his handiwork. The weight of his final hours pressed down on me. The image of him sitting in that dark house, heart failing, while he meticulously joined those expensive cherry boards. This is where the story takes a turn so dark, I almost hesitated to record this part. We found something else in that hidden cavity, something that changes everything we thought we knew about David's final conversation with Sarah. What I'm about to reveal in the next act is deeply disturbing and involves a level of cruelty that is hard to process. If you have a weak heart or if family betrayal is a trigger for you, this might be your last chance to stop watching. Before we open the final door to the truth, I'm warning you. The audio we found will stay with you forever. Are you ready for the absolute truth? I pressed play on the small digital recorder, my thumb trembling against the plastic casing. The audio was grainy, filled with the static of a stormy night, but the voices were unmistakable. It wasn't just a plan to overdose David. It was Sarah laughing, her voice a cold, sharp blade as she described how she'd been skimming from our family account since the day they married. My stomach lurched, a physical wave of nausea that forced me to lean against the peeling motel wallpaper. Then, a heavy click sounded from the bathroom door behind me. I spun around, my breath hitching in my throat, as a tall, gaunt figure stepped slowly out of the shadows. My heart didn't just skip. It seemed to stop entirely as I stared into the face of the man I had buried 3 weeks ago. David stood there, his skin the color of damp parchment and his eyes sunken, but he was undeniably breathing. I felt the air leave my lungs in a ragged sob, my legs turning to water as I collapsed onto the edge of the bed. This wasn't a ghost or a hallucination born of my broken grief. Jim Halloway stepped in behind him, his face set in a grim, apologetic mask. The funeral, the closed casket, and the weeping widow. It had all been a clinical, high-stakes deception designed to flush the rats out. The memories of the last month began to shift and grind like tectonic plates in my mind, reconfiguring into a terrifying new reality. That Sunday morning when I refused David my truck wasn't a failure of my character, but a necessary part of the script he was already writing to keep me safe. He had used the digitalis not to die, but to induce a temporary controlled state of clinical stasis that fooled the corrupt paramedics Mark Vance had on his payroll. Every tear I shed at the cemetery was the fuel they needed to believe their plan had succeeded. The Brazilian cherry vault was never meant for me to find alone. It was the start of his resurrection. David knelt before me, his hands, the ones I taught to hold a chisel, grasping my shoulders with a desperate living strength. He revealed that Sarah was actually Mark Vance's daughter from a previous hidden marriage, a plant sent to dismantle our lives from the inside out years ago. The betrayal was foundational, a rot that started long before the first dollar went missing. I looked at my son, the stranger I thought I'd lost, and felt a cold, sharp clarity replace my confusion. Before we move to the final confrontation where we trap the woman who tried to kill us both, I need to know, are you still here? Type "still here" below. On Wednesday, November 15th at precisely 2 p.m., I walked into the Vance construction boardroom, my heavy tool bag clutched in a white-knuckled grip. The room was filled with the city's zoning board and 3 municipal auditors, all gathered to finalize the $30 million redevelopment contract. Mark Vance sat at the head of the table, looking every bit the successful titan, while Sarah stood beside him in her carefully tailored morning black. The atmosphere was sterile, smelling of mahogany and cold air. I felt the cold metal of Martha's tape measure in my pocket, reminding me that structural integrity always starts at the foundation. My heart hammered like a trapped bird against my ribs. David stepped through the double doors behind me, his face gaunt, but his presence overwhelming like a thunderclap in a library. The room went deathly silent, the air rushing out of the board members as if the building had suddenly depressurized. Sarah's face didn't just turn pale, it turned a bruised, sickly gray as she clutched the back of a leather chair for support. Mark Vance let out a strangled sound, his expensive fountain pen snapping in his fingers and leaking blue ink across the $30 million contract. This was the moment the floor gave way beneath them, the instant their manufactured reality collided with the living, breathing proof of their absolute failure. I didn't wait for them to speak. I reached into my bag and slammed the vacuum-sealed bricks of cash onto the table. I followed them with the brown digitalis vial and the digital recorder, the plastic hitting the mahogany with a finality that echoed. Jim Halloway signaled the police, who entered the room with their badges shimmering under the harsh fluorescent lights. I pressed play, and Sarah's cold, mocking laughter filled the boardroom, her voice detailing the precise dosage needed to stop David's heart. The board members recoiled in visible disgust, their faces reflecting the horror of realizing they were moments away from signing a deal with two cold-blooded, calculating killers. Sarah finally snapped, the mask of the grieving widow shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces as she lunged toward the table. She screamed that David was a boring, self-righteous anchor who never understood her worth, confessing that she deserved every cent of the $2 million. Mark tried to silence her, but the panic had taken root, and he blurted out that the zoning board had already been paid their shares. It was a total, catastrophic collapse of their defense, a waterfall of admissions that guaranteed their destruction in front of a dozen credible witnesses. The cold rage in my chest finally began to cool, replaced by a grim, hard-won satisfaction. Sergeant Miller stepped forward, the metallic click of handcuffs sounding like a judge's gavel as they locked around Sarah's slender, deceitful wrists. They were read their Miranda rights against a backdrop of flashing blue lights and the hushed whispers of the disgraced board members. Mark Vance was charged with first-degree attempted murder, embezzlement of $30 million, and grand larceny, while Sarah faced additional charges of insurance fraud. They were led out through the lobby, exposed to the very employees they had spent years exploiting for their own gain. The specific weight of their crimes was finally being measured, and for the first time in weeks, I could finally breathe. The legal consequences were swift and surgical. Mark received 25 years without parole, while Sarah was sentenced to 18 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary. Every cent of my $80,000 was returned to me, along with a court-ordered restitution from the Vance estate. The city revoked Mark's construction licenses, effectively dismantling his empire brick by crooked brick. I stood outside the courthouse with David, the winter sun finally breaking through the heavy gray clouds and reflecting off the courthouse windows. We didn't need words. I just reached out and gripped his hand, feeling the living warmth of a son who was no longer a ghost in the floorboards.